Well, I'm going to go ahead and welcome you all and introduce our awesome alumnus that we have with us tonight, Jesse Marks. We are so excited that he is joining us. And currently, he is a foreign affairs and policy expert with extensive experience in foreign policy, peace and conflict studies, humanitarian response, and China Middle East relations. He is the associate director for the Middle East and China with the Edelman Global Advisory, and he previously served as an advisor for Middle East policy in the Office of the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Middle East Policy from 2020 to 2022. Marks has spent 5 years in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East as a Boren Scholar, a Fulbright Fellow at the Jordan Center for Strategic Studies, Scoville Fellow at the Stimson Centers Protecting Civilians in Conflict, and a Schwarzman Scholar at Tsinghua University in Beijing. His work is published with the Washington Post, the Carnegie Middle East, Foreign Affairs, the Atlantic Council, the Middle East Institute, and more. He holds a master's in global affairs from Tsinghua University, Beijing, a master's in philosophy and international relations and politics from the University of Cambridge, a Bachelor of Arts in Middle East Studies from Florida State, and an Associate of Arts degree from Florida Community College of Jacksonville. I'd also like to personally add that Jesse is one of our distinguished young alumni here from Florida State. Just this year, he received the Ruben Odiascu Young Alumni Award, which is the highest honor bestowed upon young alumni by the FSU Alumni Association. So we're so excited to have him here. It's quite a bio. I don't think I'll ever have one that great, but thank you, Jesse. And then our student moderator for today is Brandon Sarijo. Brandon serves as the graduate program assistant for transfer student services here at Florida State. He is a first-generation transfer student who started his educational journey at Broward College and graduated with his Associate of Arts degree in 2018. He then went on to the University of Florida, graduating in 2020 with his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science. Now at Florida State University, he is pursuing his Master of Social Work. So I am so thankful that Brandon is here to moderate this discussion. So thank you both. But Jesse, why don't you start us off by briefly talking to us about your journey to Florida State, through Florida State, and then how you got to your current position now?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for having me, first of all. I think, Brandon, one of the cool things that we share is transfer students, Transfer Students Unite. I think it was one of the defining components of my entire career so far. But even before I transferred to Florida State, I started traveling to the Middle East in 2010 to pursue a nerdy, deep love of archaeology and just generally to see the world outside of the southeast of the United States, Florida for that region. While I was there, saw kind of the early stages of the Arab Spring, some of the protests, and then the beginning of the Syrian civil war, which kind of flowed over in 2011. And just having been in the region and hearing the history of the region and its connection to the U.S. and great powers of the Iraq War. A lot of those things ultimately inspired me to transfer from community college where I was at in Jacksonville to FSU to really just focus on studying Arabic to better understand the region, to understand the people that I talked to and the story and make sense of the stories from the many friends I had made while I was there. While at FSU, it was like drinking from a fire hose, walking onto campus as a transfer student in spring, not fall. It was a very foreign environment, very new to me. Most of my free time for my first semester really went to studying Arabic and making sure I had a strong basis in my studies. I remember being in Strozier on like a Friday night, and I went down into like the special collections and found a book from Gertrude Bell in the bowels of the library, and I think I spent like 4 hours reading it. She's like one of these like powerful political actors who helped define a lot of the Middle East borders. So like really random things. So that was like kind of the bulk of my academic time was really just spent getting smart on a lot of these topics and really learning the language. But then when I kind of moved away from that and got involved in campus life, my home base was the Middle East Center and Honor Scholars Fellows House. They became my family, and Dr. Filer and everyone else, Dr. Gerritsen became pretty much my family, and they are until now. They played such a big part. After that, I guess it was about 2015, I left FSU and was pretty determined to study in the region. Spent the next 4 or so years traveling and working and studying in Jordan through various roles. A lot of my work from the Syrian civil war It was a bit of a tough time, leaving Florida, leaving the US and kind of finding my own way, but I'm really grateful. Through a lot of these programs, you find some really incredible communities, and those really tend to be what sustain you. Um, and then around like 2018, when the Syrian war was taking a bit more of a unique turn, I began to like see trends where China was getting involved and speaking more loudly about parts of the Middle East, and had this weird career diversion to go look in grad school and kind of study politics more formally rather than just history in the Middle East, languages and history. So I went to Cambridge in 2018 and focused on kind of the politics of humanitarianism, was like understanding what was actually happening underneath the surface when it came to like UN actors in Syria. And then I went to China, which is a bit of a weird left for a lot of people who knew me. And it was really like looking at that intersection of like China's interest in the Middle East interest in China, how China engages in conflict. And then COVID broke out, and that was 2020. And like many folks who are around the world, I got effectively left China, bounced to the Middle East and tried to make my way, and eventually made my way back to the US, where I had the opportunity after graduating from Tsinghua to join the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where I was working on Middle East policy for the Deputy Assistant Secretary's office. It was a really great time. I worked on Jordan and Lebanon and Israel. Some really opportune times and some really critical times under the last two administrations. So yeah, really unmatched opportunities. And really grateful for the time. And now I'm here, and just departed from DoD in the last month and a half, and I'm starting in the private sector and really looking at new opportunities of building, focusing on, everything from business to like development and climate, and getting to kind of touch on a lot of really unique areas that are pretty new to me, but it's been a fun ride so far.
Wow, wow, wow. I mean, from what I hear, first off, Jesse, you are incredibly accomplished and you have a ton of amazing accolades underneath your belt. But what I also am kind of gathering from your story is just the amount of transition that you've been to. You've went from your community college to Florida State, then from Florida State to the other side of the world, and then to the other part of the world after that. So just a lot of great transition. So it really just means a lot that you're willing to engage with, our current students who are also potentially looking at their own transition, also looking at, going to their respective corner of the world. So kind of bringing it back home a little bit to Florida State and to Tallahassee. I know you touched on this a little bit with some of your engagement, but can you go into a little bit more detail of what you were engaged in during your time at Florida State and how that sort of continued to guide the work that you do today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, it all came down to people. When I started at FSU, like I said, I took a bit of a break and was going to like focus just on doing my studies and getting my feet under me when it came to academics. But when I kind of jumped in and got academics locked down, I waded into campus involvement and got to explore a lot of different areas. And the areas I found that I felt most home in and that I loved were, anything dealing with international students. So, working down the globe, or working for the Center for Intensive English, and I did a lot of volunteering there. And then working with the Honor Scholars Fellows House, pretty much anything and everything that they were doing, I tried to jump in on, just because that community was a place where I felt that I'd contribute, but also grow. There were a lot of, people who had big dreams and big visions. So it's, it's one of those places where you can learn from a lot of people, and kind of even broaden your own understanding of how you think about the world and how you think about the specific issues that you care about. I think probably for me, though, one of the most impactful things of my time at FSU was the interface of FSU with the community. And I worked pretty heavily with refugee communities. And back then I was volunteering with the Office of Refugee Services. So back then we had a few in the 20s or 30s Syrian refugees in different communities that were being resettled to the region at the time. So I got to work a lot with the community leadership on building those up, and that was really one of the big things which tied me to the region, but also allowed me to contribute to the community again. And it was actually through that opportunity that when I went to Jordan, a lot of kind of the opportunities that flowed into place came through several of the relationships I made through working with the refugee community and with the different like state leaders in Florida that were involved in that process.
So you kind of connected what you did here across the world. It's exactly what you described earlier of like plugging and playing is what we like to tell our students. So that's really great, and I'm really happy to hear that you were able to connect that experience to assist refugees into that humanitarian space. Again, who are also transitioning in their own world and in their own right into a whole other, quite literally foreign world for them. So sort of in that same vein of transition, you are a transfer student and you did transfer in the spring, which, is incredibly challenging for our transfer students. So can you talk a little bit about what that was like for you and, what challenges you did have? And, I know you mentioned too, that you got the academic pieces kind of settled. How did you go about settling those academic pieces as well?
Certainly. I mean, I think the biggest challenge is most people get 4 full uninterrupted years in undergrad. I had 2. So I think that was a sobering thing that I had to come to terms with pretty quickly. But I was determined to use them as productively as possible. So I mean, in terms of the academic side, like I went to FSU to study Arabic. I didn't have as much exploring as other folks who kind of transfer in and want to see, what they want to study. I did have the added benefit of knowing exactly what I wanted to do there. So, the first 6 months or so were finding my mentors on campus, people who would invest in me, and those times where like 2 a.m, you're like stressed out and you wake up and need coffee at 7 a.m. You call a professor and be like, hey, I'm struggling on this. Can I come talk to you? Like those people, particularly as a transfer student, right? I think made my campus experience. I can't tell you the number of times where I would just be losing my mind or like wanting to rip my hair out before an Arabic exam because I can't explain something, and they would just call me and be like, "Hey, I saw you the other day, and you look like you've been hiding in a closet for 3 weeks because your skin is pasty white. Like, are you okay?" And I cannot thank all those people enough. I talk to them regularly. I see them regularly. They still are really big parts of my life. But in terms of like campus involvement and stuff, it was like balancing the academic side because you only have 2 years and you want to, if you want to get a good GPA, you have to balance that with wanting to get involved. I tried as much as possible, like you're saying, with refugees and kind of international students to marry the parts of what I was wanting to do long term with, what I was doing in terms of like campus service. So I like joined student government and was working on student senate, and like a lot of my work was focusing on, how do we get funding to the international students? How do we help, kind of integrate international students onto campus? So there was a lot of carryover between the types of campus involvement I did, the types of community involvement I did, and with my studies. There was a lot of, Arab students and students from the Middle East who had an interest in the Middle East. So, we had the Arab Student Union, we had, did a lot of like Arabic like food nights at the Globe during the coffee hour, which if y'all haven't been, I highly encourage you to go to. They still do it. It's fantastic. There's also an Arabic film cinema or an Arab cinema festival coming up soon, which I saw in my email this week. So definitely go to that. But yeah, like really blending all of those things and finding your passion through not just your studies, but kind of weaving that thread made those 2 years consistent, cohesive, and really integrated in ways that I don't think I would have if I didn't know what I was wanting to do coming in as a transfer student.
And to your point there too, I mean, it looks like during your time, not only just as during your undergrad time, not only were you focused on your own personal advocacy, right, but also the advocacy of others. From what it sounds like, working to advocate on behalf of our international students who, as I'm sure have their own struggles transitioning to Florida State, again on a completely different perspective. And the fact that you're advocating for them while also advocating for yourself and finding that balance is so great and really important to do and for our students to learn as well. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like your career kind of takes a shift from advocacy to analyzing our history and analyzing our international politics. So can you give me a little bit of some insight into your experience in the field of global affairs and international relations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, it was those times in Jordan, Boren and Fulbright, where I was really kind of getting my teeth dirty and getting my hands into kind of the meat of the topic. Starting from working with refugees in Jacksonville and refugees in Tallahassee, and then basically going to the actual conflict itself, right? And then asking the question, okay, how do we help address vulnerable populations? How do we protect vulnerable populations in conflict? It becomes something where you become deeply intertwined with, what is conflict? How does conflict evolve? What does conflict resolution look like? A lot of these big questions that we ask within international relations, which underpin a lot of international relations theory, whether we're talking about Afghanistan, Libya, Sudan, Ukraine, a lot of these things that we're talking about really come down to a lot of these just like big questions. I think my focus in research kind of evolved. I mean, activism maintained and advocacy maintained a part of what I was doing, but it, going from advocating on behalf of someone means, articulating what the problem is and being able to understand what the problem is and how it impacts other parts and other interests. Because wars in themselves are about actors that have interests, and those interests, whether they're logical or not, defined or not, play a part. So a lot of it was really, a lot of global affairs and a lot of what I was doing was really integrated across multiple levels. So I found myself being a researcher, I found myself being an analyst, I found myself being a diplomat, I found myself being a mediator. So you began to take on a lot of roles. And I think I know a lot of people, like I'm here in DC, a lot of people, you can watch House of Cards, not even House of Cards, you can watch Madam Secretary, all these things. And we think like global affairs is a very sexy field, and in many ways it is, right? You get to do some really cool stuff, don't get me wrong. But it can also be deeply frustrating and deeply depressing. And I think I've been able to see both sides of those coins. And I don't know, it's hard to explain, but it's one of those things that the more you kind of see in the world, the easier it is to break through a lot of those core stereotypes that you have about, conflict is, it's a weird thing. But kind of through my career, whether it was from, moving from working with refugees up to, working as kind of advising on defense policy, the core for me, the core emphasis on humanitarianism never changed. Rather, going from working on helping people, providing aid cross border to working on defense really is about understanding how those worlds interact. Because my next trajectory and kind of where I'm looking at going next is understanding China's role in conflict and like how China and the US and that competition interacts. And then based on that entire interaction, how do we then protect people in those situations? How do you work with two actors who have, the gap in their interests is as wide, yet there are people in the center, and you have to figure out how to work these two sides to kind of build that protection in the middle. So I think I rambled a little bit there, but it's really about weaving those various positions and threads and being able to explain and understand all of those parts.
Yeah. Well, first off, I don't think you're rambling, and also like you're the main event here. So if you ramble, it's okay. Like you're the reason why we're here, right? So I guess to your point, because you mentioned global affairs can be sexy, but it also has some pieces where it can be really stressful and really depressing, in your words, right? So even though you mentioned that, from what you're saying, there's a lot of passion behind the words that you're sharing with us. And while passion is a very strong word, I know it's a strong word for me, and I can imagine it's a strong word for some of our undergrads. What are some things that fuel your passion for this line of work, despite the hard days that come through? What keeps you going?
People. I mean, if there's one thing I've learned, whether it was working on the Syrian conflict, whether it was, working in DoD or working or living in China, working in the UK, wherever I was at, everything comes down to people, good and bad. People start wars, people end wars, people suffer in wars. Kind of really understanding the human component of all of that. And understanding like what humanity means and how you interact with humanity. Like, what are your values? What are my values? How do I see these things? Coming to peace with that understanding, I think, to me, is what really fuels a lot of this. Whether it was helping refugees or at least looking at vulnerable populations that are in transitions, that are suffering in conflict, that are in climate crises, these types of things. Like it really comes down to finding ways, whether innovative or historic, to help those people. And I think that despite the good and the bad that often comes along with working in this field and the hard days, right? You can have a month of just pure banging your head against the wall on a policy, but when you finally break through that wall, the 50 people, the 100 people that get food or whatever it is, the woman that ends up having her child in a hospital as opposed to the middle of the desert, right? Those are the moments that really kind of outshine all of the other darkness and frustration in those situations.
I think you put that incredibly eloquently. You put it really well together. Just I think that what we often don't see in the media are the people. We don't see, you know, the people that are affected by the policies, and the people that go behind making the policies who care about people like you. So kind of shifting gears a little bit, a little kind of current events and current affairs. We did have a audience submitted question that discussed the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So I'll just read it out through and through. On the withdrawal from Afghanistan, can you explain why so many in the international affairs community seemed convinced that it was strategically better for us to stay as opposed to leave? And how much are you able to discuss on that, Jess?
Y'all are not making this easy for me. So I will first say that whoever asked the question, feel free to reach out. I would love to dig into this because I would love to hear your perspective on this. I know you guys are like fresh studying this, so like you can probably teach me a bunch. So I'm absolutely keen to hear from you. I think, let me see if I can frame this well. I think they're actually on both sides. People argued both positions. One, that it was strategically better for us to stay. Other people said that it was strategically better for us to leave. When you're dealing in policy, right, in some cases there are bad decisions and there are worse decisions. You've probably heard this adage before, but so much of policy is about, you know, determining a course of action, analyzing the risks and the possibilities, and try to identify what direction you're heading toward. And a lot of people debate, you know, I think one of the more interesting nuanced components of your question is a lot of people, yes, have debated that it was better for us to stay, but they couldn't give a longitudinal understanding of what that would look like. Right. So you amplify your exposure to risk and you amplify the possible kind of trends of uncertainty that occur long term. And then on the flip side, you had a lot of people who said, well, yeah, we should just leave, but who argued that the way that we need to leave should have been different, or that, you know, there should have been a specific structure, timeline. So there's a lot of ways of looking at this. It's very nuanced. So I don't think I can give you an answer as to why some people think it was strategically better to stay. I think in one sense, you know, there's a lot of historic baggage that would, you know, seeing the Taliban, who we've been fighting for the last 2 decades, rise to power with all the investment money that we've put in there, right? You know, in one vein, you have people who see that and are frustrated by that, right? Because there is a legitimate humanitarian crisis now. And Afghanistan, there's a lot of ongoing policy debates about how we address it. And that is truly a hard question. And I think it's going to be one that you all, you know, the folks at FSU who are brilliant in studying right now, social science scholars, folks who are in the international relations side, that you all are going to be addressing that in the next 5 years. That's going to be a longitudinal problem. So start reading, start studying, start talking to people. So, I mean, you can put yourself in that position and see how you would answer it. I think one of the more interesting ways I would encourage you to look about it, not just in the concept of like whether it's better to stay or go, but rather what did the end of Afghanistan and U.S. involvement in Afghanistan mean in terms of a war on terror, right? So the post-2001 period, myself, everyone in my class who did Boren with me, Fulbright with me 10 years before me, my sister who was a Boren Scholar to Jordan, you know, the next people 5 years after me who graduated, like we were raised in international relations perspective that was endelved in the war on terror. And like we are at this like very interesting strategic pivot where we're moving on that mentality, right? What we're focusing on now is not necessarily a war in Al-Qaeda or is a war in ISIS. Those are very big pieces in our international relations, but concepts of like China and Russia are now re-entering the fray, and you're having conversations on great power competition, words that we haven't heard since, you know, around the Cold War. So what does that actually mean for like how we study and how we ask questions about strategy? I think is something that's worthwhile to think about as you kind of go into your studies, just because of the world in terms of how we think about foreign policy is changing. And in having seen it in government firsthand in a lot of the conversations that are going on, you know, I think what the end of the war on terror means to kind of the U.S. psyche when it comes to foreign policy is going to be a powerful question that still has no answers. So maybe you guys can be the ones who write those papers and kind of have those conversations when you're in government.
And I love the manifesting words when you make it, when you write these papers, because we, you know, our students in this Zoom room are the future. You know, they will be following right behind your footsteps in terms of making an impact on our globe. To that end, we did have a submitted question from one of our students who just wanted to know a little bit about what your current position and what the day-to-day life of your current position looks like over at the Edelman Global Advisory. So if you can just speak on that.
Yeah, absolutely. We are currently on telework, which I love because I've been going in office pretty much every day since COVID started. So I'm enjoying the brief reprieve. But I mean, generally, so we work on like strategic advisory consulting for companies, doing public service, private service. The organization I work with particularly is exciting because they do a lot with climate change. They do a lot with ecological preservation. So I'm getting to really kind of talk about a very different kind of global issue right now, which is kind of, I mean, nothing is divorced from the politics of, international relations, but getting to work on issues that are about like collective restoration of the world and dealing with, issues that are common to all mankind that impact everyone is really exciting to get to dig into. So like, I'm thinking about, oh gosh, what are some of the questions that I was asking today? How do nations in Africa adapt to climate change? So if, when it gets, say, it gets 1.8 degrees warmer over X number of years, how do nations develop and adapt their national strategies and policies to allow for, say, continued water access, agricultural sustainment, ecological preservation, continuity of fisheries? So a lot of those big questions I get to kind of wrestle with in my day-to-day, as well as like how they intersect to the China and the Middle East, because I think it's 17 out of 20 of the countries in Africa are on the critical critical risk of ecological climate change. So anyway, big picture stuff on that, and kind of getting to work with a lot of clients who kind of are asking those questions and thinking through those kind of big ideas. So very different to what I was doing, but nonetheless important. And I think in many ways, if not even more important.
Yeah, and it sounds again to me that there is a lot more of a combination or a marriage between advocacy and analyzing roles in your space right now. So I did have a question in terms of, what is something that our current FSU students can get into on a micro level of, within Florida and the Tallahassee community to engage and learn their practice or their craft in advocacy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the one benefit about FSU historically of the many is that FSU has always been a university, even going back to the 60s, during the civil rights movement, that has led. It has always been a university that's led by example rather than kind of catching up to the rest of the state and to the South and to kind of the country. So FSU has kind of a prestigious history of advocacy. And sometimes that is contentious, and sometimes it, whether in student government certain things come up, like we are in Florida, those are things that we have to contend with, but you can really find opportunities to expand and explore what advocacy looks like, whether in a grassroots level through local issues in Tallahassee. If you're interested in international relations and you speak a language, go work with International Rescue Committee as an intern, or like just go volunteer your time to help support Afghan families that are getting relocated to Florida after August last year. If you're interested in government or lobbying or like specific interest advocacy, whether that's going to be for, say, refugee issues or for education and pedagogical issues, like go find an institution in Tallahassee in the state of Florida and be like, hey, yo, I'm in the Capitol. I can like literally run down the street, say hi to like Florida congressmen, and begin to kind of integrate those relationships. And because you are in the Capitol, you can really capitalize, bad pun, on being in and around power and understand how people have conversations about policy and how kind of the decision-making process is moved. So you're really in a brilliant space, being literally a few streets down from the Capitol. And I get that it's a contentious political climate these days, but what a better time to learn. There's not. Like, it's when you're in grad school, undergrad, working through these core concepts, talking when all the information is fresh in your head, you're thinking through the theory, like you can actually literally go apply it.
And I love, and especially now because I'm not sure if you know, but Florida State has a formative experience requirement, right? Of like, our students are going to have to start applying these things and these skills in the actual, whether through a shadowing or internship experience, which kind of leads me to this next question of, a student asked us, it seems like you always knew what you wanted to do, Jesse. So what advice would you give to those of us who are struggling finding their passion? And they also asked if, are we putting too much pressure on ourselves to find passion or to find interest in things?
To this, I'll answer the second first and then go to the first. I mean, it really comes down to you. Like in general, how much you want to take and design and think through what your life looks like that is up to you. Like, you are the master of your, we say that all the time, you are the master of the future. Or I don't remember, I said that adage wrong. But I understand and have in the last few years have seen the impact both among folks that I've studied with and worked with, even in myself, of what happens when you get overburned out, when you just run out of fume. So as you are thinking about these things, you don't necessarily have to put pressure on yourself to find a passion, right? I graduated FSU as a fifth semester senior, and like took my time in community college and like worked my way through school because like my one passion was I knew that I loved the Middle East. Like, I knew that I liked archaeology and I knew that I enjoyed being there. I had no idea at any point, even in 2018, almost a decade later, that I was going to study China. Like, and then as I like found out that I wanted to study China, I was like, I wonder what's driving this interest. And it's like, well, okay, it's easy. It's people. I really enjoy learning the new experiences of people. I like being in what we would define as contentious environments where, people's ideologies are often mixed and competing, but you can sit down with a bunch of people, have a conversation and learn. Whether that was like working with refugees and trying to understand their experiences, advocate on their behalf, or whether it was, doing mediation between varying components of a conflict, or like showing or explaining why we need to get aid to X area to B area with 9 other reasons in the middle, right? It really came down to, I enjoyed working with people, understanding people's perspectives, but it started with just a casual love for the Middle East and archaeology. So if you ask me what my passion is, like, I would say the Middle East. It's not war, it's not conflict, it's not all these things. It was the Middle East. And then through the Middle East, I began to understand that like I loved working with people and victims of conflict and helping them kind of find some sense of peace, some sense of stability in what is an often just as deeply unstable environment in their lives. So, I mean, I wouldn't put pressure on yourself to find that. It often, honestly, it comes with time. You live your life. Sometimes you do things that you don't like and you're like, oh, this is terrible. And through that, you learn what you do like. That's definitely a big part of it. I hope that answers your question. It's one of those things that people ask all the time. And there's never really an answer for it. It's, you might think about something that you might like NFTs, or you might like art and like have an opportunity to like make NFTs, and that's your passion, right? And there's a way to make money from it. Like, go for it. Like you could, I mean, there's a million and five things. Like I love archaeology and I spend a lot of my free time like poring over maps. I don't get a penny for it, but like I'm learning to translate a dead language simply because like there's a bunch of these inscriptions in the middle of the desert and like I generally know where they're at, and I'm like going out there to try to understand them. Make no money from it, but I love it. It's just sometimes you do stuff because you like it.
And I think too, for our students, it's like you mentioned, doing stuff because you like it, but if you happen to be able to get paid for it, that's even better, right? You're not only combining the passion, but you're also combining the money that comes with the passion. But I think you put it eloquently, like sometimes you're just gonna have to try it and figure out if you like it or not. Being a young professional myself, there are many things that I've tried that I hate. And now I'm finally in a space that I love. And it took a while to figure out. So I'm really glad that you shared that, because I definitely think, again, in our modern day media and what's, sort of shared with our students is that they kind of have to have it all figured out as soon as they're done. But, it's a marathon, not a sprint, definitely through college or even after that.
If I could add one thing to that, I think you made a really important point, is like you took time to try things. I think one of the biggest things that I learned, particularly in undergrad, is that like you don't have to sprint to graduate. I mean, yes, there are real costs that come with like taking more time, right? Sometimes it costs more. Luckily, being at FSU, like it is a state school as opposed to like I had friends who went to like Ivy League and dilly-dallied and like had like tens and $20,000-$30,000 per year because of, but like at FSU there's more opportunity, even in community college, right? You have TCC down the road where like if you want to take time to explore something but can't necessarily afford a class at FSU, like see if you can go take a class at community college where it might be a bit cheaper, right? Like never be afraid to just like sit on something, and like if you don't graduate by like 2022, like you're not gonna die. Like if you don't graduate by like 2023, like sometimes, and I know a lot of my community in DC that I work with, we a good friend Nick, who's of mine, who's currently on a Marshall right now in the UK, was transfer student, there was a kind of a weird group of us who came together in DC in 2020 during COVID, and we're like, let's create a community that advocates on behalf of community college students. I have friends that are Rhodes Scholars. I have friends that all the way across the board who have done this. And like a lot of them were, late graduates. They were people who like took time to really understand what they wanted, who took time to experiment and, study this and go this way, or like study this and go that way. And like they are deeply successful people. And they can articulate their passions very well, but it's not because they woke up one day and said, I want to do this. It's because like they woke up multiple days being like, I wonder about this. Doesn't make me happy. I wonder about this. It's not like feasibly long-term. Like it's a process of trial and error.
Yeah, and you mentioned, quick note, our director of trans student services said in the chat, that is awesome. I see a book coming soon. So can't wait to get a book. That'll be great. Either a textbook or like a memoir. We love it all. So in the same vein of success, one of our students in the call, Amelia, asked this question: on what basis are professionals in your field evaluated, and how is success measured?
That's a great question. Sometimes I think it's arbitrary. No, I think it really depends on where within, like, global affairs is a massive field, from like oil conglomerate companies to like ocean climate advocates. Like you have the span from NGOs to government to, and it really depends on which one. So for the first 3 years of my career, so from 2016 to 2018, there was no real evaluation because I was largely working on my own and kind of, I would say, working for myself. But a lot of success was really like user driven. It was very much so like driven by, how many weekends am I going to give up, or sleepless nights am I going to take? A lot of people that I know in the field who have found a lot of success have not taken that route. They did not like, have migraines till 2 a.m. drinking just massive amounts of coffee. I think one way that, depending on if you go through a company, like there's always going to be a like private sector, there's going to be a measurement or kind of approach to review that's going to be predicated upon, what do you produce? What value do you bring to the company? In government, it's very different. It's right, to what degree are you asserting leadership or understanding the content or working to like learn how to create and move policy from point A to point B. So in my process, it was like, how well can I write? How well can I brief? How well can I think through a strategic idea creatively, or how well can I operate without kind of oversight? So there's a lot of those things, and those kind of play across the board in international relations. So you hit on key skill sets like how well do you write? Can you summarize complex ideas simply? Can you, at least in a lot of my stuff was, writing points for the Secretary of Defense and some of these things, like, you have to, learning your leadership, how does he think? How does the person below him think? How does the person below that person think? How does the person below that person think? Because one document has to go all the way up, and sometimes it comes all the way back down. And it's, you learn it as you go. In kind of the advocacy space, it's very different, right? It really depends on the organization. So I chose to go the fellowship route, Boren, Fulbright, these other programs, because it was more autonomy and there was more direct, responsibility on my shoulders to produce. So like I started writing and publishing when I was at FSU. Actually, my first paper came out in 2016 when I came back from Boren and was getting ready to graduate. I pursued writing as a way of kind of self-benchmarking what I was learning and where I was at, simply because writing is how I interacted with the world. For other people, it's not. Some people, like, they love working in like a government bureaucracy, right? They're really good at meeting people and knowing who to talk to and how to move information. And right, that's a big thing that's deeply valued in government. Versus like if you want to be a stoic, great policy, realist or thinker on, theory, you could, someone at Oxford that I know joked that he's like, oh, we have these like grand theorists and strategists, and occasionally we put them in front of people, but normally we leave them in their offices, right? So, it just really depends on where you go. But if there's a specific sector that you are interested in talking about, I'm happy to take an ear and see if I can help you kind of think through that.
And sort of, I know you touched on this really briefly with the experiences with your fellowships. Another student asked us, they said a lot of your experience came from your fellowships. How did you get involved in the fellowship application process at Florida State?
So I'm gonna, if you have a pen and paper or on your computer, write this down. Honors Scholars Fellows House. Give Amy a ring, annoy her, tell her I said to. Call Dr. Filer. Really just go and hang out. Like, there's always something going on. So when I came on as a transfer student, I didn't qualify for the honors college. It just wasn't a thing at the time that was allowed. And to my knowledge, it is now. Like, you can transfer in, which is deeply exciting to me. And I'm like, yes, like, just because, you know, I'm very tribal with transfer students. But you know, we had something that was like, you know, honors in the major, where you write a dissertation or a thesis. And for me, like, I came in, I didn't even know about that, except because I met other students who were at the Honors Scholars Fellows House. I was like, oh, there's this thing called honors in the major. I can't graduate in the honors college, but I can do this other thing, which is very similar. Like, ta-da! It's, you know, one day I met someone who's like, oh yeah, I'm studying for this thing called a critical language scholarship, and I'm going to apply. And I was like, oh, critical language scholarship, what's that? Oh, you know, you go somewhere for a summer and apply. It's like very competitive, so you might not get it. I applied for it and I didn't get it. I was like, this is interesting. I learned a lot about myself during this application. And like Dr. Filer and the team that I was working with back then were like, so what was it like? And I was like, it was a rush. It was weird. Like, I understand something about myself that I didn't understand before. And then, you know, as I began to like get a better idea of like, you know, I wanted to study in the Middle East, I wanted to do these things, like, you know, I could have those conversations. I could pick up the phone or an email and send it over to the HSF team, be like, hey, can I talk to you about X? I want to study Arabic and I'm interested in Jordan. How do I make that happen? And they'll be like, oh, there's this great program called the Boren program, or have you heard of Fulbright? And I'm like, yes. So over time, like, you these people just become like family, right? And there was never a time where I ever felt unwelcome. There was never a time where like I felt that I could not come in and ask questions, even when there was a line down, right? Because more people figured out like the big secret of FSU. Like, it's just like exciting camaraderie, because I met like 3 other people on a line waiting to like have a conversation with Dr. Filer, and I learned in that like 4-minute conversation someone who was like applying for a National Science Foundation fellowship, or someone who was applying to go out to like Caltech to do some like deep like PhD preparation stuff. Like, you just meet cool people doing cool things, and you know, it creates a sense of camaraderie with that community. Like, I still keep up with a lot of my HSF colleagues and like people who I got to know through those processes. So yeah, I go to the HSF house and have conversations. The other way to do it is there's another resource that I find that's quite good. It's called ProFellow, PROFELLOW. And it was founded by a woman who was a fellow, had done several fellowships throughout her time, and has basically created a resource that pretty much is every fellowship in, I won't say in the world, but most fellowships in the world. You can literally search by interest, area of interest, those types of things. And another resource I would recommend is the GCCT, so the Global Community College and Transfer Network, GCCTN. Every summer we host a kind of, if you're interested in international relations and these things, we kind of host like a workshop every summer, in which, you know, we'll have different panels of people come in. I believe we had an ambassador last year. Like, we have some pretty cool people come in and talk to, you know, transfer students, community college students, people who are, you know, students in their 30s, people who are doing career changes. Like, really cool, you know, opportunity, and basically helping folks find ways and pathways into government and fellowship opportunities. There's a lot out there. Those are just kind of 3: HSF, ProFellow, and GCT. Those are kind of the 3 that are coming to my mind now. But I would also never underestimate someone with 5 minutes in Google. You can find a lot.
And one thing definitely I want to emphasize that we are trying to, you know, we emphasize to our students is making intentional connections. And that's what you did. You just went into the office and was like, hey, I'm Jesse, what's up? Like, what is there for me? And the impact that those, you know, 5 minutes of intentional connection that you made, how that's now led your entire career and opened up all these doors for you. So it's amazing what 5 minutes can do for the rest of your life. So I know we are running on time, so we do have 2 other questions for you, Mr. Jesse. So the first question is, you know, as you have shared with us, and as I know Amy has shared as well, you have an incredibly distinguished background. You have a lot of notches in your belt. So how do you find time to engage with Florida State and your alma mater, and some of our current students that are at Florida State?
Yeah, so a lot of times it's professors and through the old communities. I finally made it back to FSU after being abroad for so long. and in general always make rounds to my old professors. And on any trip, I'll get like a list of like 5 names of people who are like wanting to study in Jordan. So there's always just kind of a constant outreach of folks. Sadly, a lot of it's just like, oh, I know someone who knew someone who knew someone who knew the student. But in general, yeah, as much time as I have available, kind of reaching out and working with students through like the GCCT network, the Global Community College Transfer Network. You know, we've had conversations with folks at HSF and talk through, you know, trying to get more folks pushed into different fellowships. So like I was a Scoville Fellow in 2017 and have had numerous conversations and I've talked to students about, you know, preparing for those kinds of fellowships and experiences. So any way that I can kind of channel and push people to like explore these ideas. First of all, like it's a fully funded, most of these are fully funded opportunities. Like I'm just gonna put my hands here and have a very serious conversation. You could get paid to do what you love. So I mean, a lot of the engagement really comes there. I'm deeply passionate. I think FSU is some of the best kind of academics. We have some of the best research. Over the years that I was there, at least, like I never received anything less than the absolute push from all of my advisors, from my mentors, from my friends to succeed, to pursue a lot of these things. And compared even to where I am now, like back then, I wouldn't consider myself like deeply driven. Like I was new on campus and I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I like found a loving community and a passion, you know, passionate people, whatever we use that term, like who like were just willing to like invest in me and like allow me to invest in them. And a lot of my engagement currently still works through that. And there's a lot of students who kind of go into HSF, who go into the Middle East program that, you know, I get to engage with and really invest in. And then do things like this, right? To get to meet the folks who are, you know, taking that next step to say like, oh, I'm going to go listen to some random dude in DC talk about his time in the Middle East, but like, you know, reach out, happy to chat. So, I mean, you know, there's that type of interaction as well. And then from the odd football game, but sadly I've not gotten into football as of late these days.
And our very, very last question for the night, which I think our students have definitely touched on in terms of, like you said, they're transitioning into wanting to get into their careers, but they're also transitioning into a workforce that is transitioning in itself through the pandemic, out of the pandemic, still in the pandemic, you know, depending on who you ask. What are some advice that you can give them when it comes to finding a role or a job with good fit and that can also engage their passions?
Oh, that's a great question. One, it goes back to the last question. FSU has a very deep and broad and illustrious and fantastic and successful and just lovingly accepting alumni community. Go hang out with the alumni community. Go hang out at the alumni center. Like that's a really easy way to meet a lot of people who are, like every other company, looking for new people to hire. And being an FSU student often is a pretty good qualifier to start off, or at least to get a foot in the door to have a conversation. I think beyond that, you're right, the hard part is like this is a transitioning workforce, right? In most companies, surprisingly, there's a large number of people getting hired right now, just because there are a lot of people resigning right now, because there's this like trade-off of like companies who want to bring fresh talent on but pay them less versus people who are like, I'm kind of done with this traditional sense of work, like I'm leaving. So that's hard actually, because I actually don't know how to answer that question, even having just maneuvered that process. The way that I went about it, which is probably a little bit weirder with my recent, was I met someone who I deeply respected, not even with the intent of getting a job, and I loved what they did. And I was like, you're someone I could work for down the line, but like I'm just really interested in understanding like how you got to where you're at in your career and, you know, why you made these decisions that you did and the sequencing in which you did them. In that conversation with that person, I now work for her. You know, 6 months later, took a while, but like in terms of just like, I didn't even have the intention of trying to work for her. It was just like, it as time worked out, it worked out. Now that might be a unicorn type of situation, but I don't think there's ever a replacement for Googling. You know, I think a very easy way is to like type in the specific types of job that you want. So say you work in tech and you want to specifically work on blockchain as it relates to climate. So then you just type in blockchain, climate, tech, job openings. And not even just to find a job, just to look at the terms, just to look at what the position is, and like think, understanding imposter syndrome is a very real thing, something that I deal with often. Like, but think through it is like, okay, how are people talking about these roles? How are people thinking? What are the words they're using? Because then as you think through like applying for a job and, your physical application process, your resume, you begin to work those specific terminologies and those words into your resume. And you can begin thinking like maybe someone in that role might, right? I don't work in climate, so I'm doing a lot of reading on climate right now, and I'm digging into a lot of things that I don't know about, and it's a deeply humbling experience, but I'm learning a lot about, particularly through terminology and through the experiences of other people. Because at the end of the day, like, you could get into a job on paper that is the perfect fit, and it could be absolutely monotonous. And you could walk into a job that on paper doesn't look great, but it's literally your dream. So I don't think there's ever really a substitute for just doing a little bit of research, trying to understand or like read or like listen to YouTube videos or TED Talks about people who work in that space. And then reach out on why am I forgetting what it's called, LinkedIn, or like through the Alumni Association, right? To find someone who has expertise in the area, just be like, can I have a 10-minute conversation with you? And like show up prepared. I mean, a lot of people like talking, so you can probably show up with like 5 minutes of prepared material, let them talk for 15, but like in general, like have questions for them, ask, do a little bit of research in advance so you generally know what they're doing. And then express interest. You don't necessarily say give me a job, and you be like, this is an area I'd really like to explore. So yeah, I think that's probably the best advice I can give you right now, but it is a changing work environment, so Godspeed.
It's good advice, Jesse. And I also think that, you kind of hit the nail on the head with networking, maintaining relationships. And I think too, you're here because you wanted to engage with our students. The students that are here tonight wanted to engage with you. So now they've made that connection with you. And not to put you on the spot, but you told me I could drop your email in the chat. So if anyone wanted to follow up, but I mean, that's a connection, especially if somebody's interested in that field. And so it was great advice. Everything you said tonight was wonderful. You still remain one of the smartest people I know. That's not changing anytime soon. See, there's your imposter syndrome. But thank you. I will forever embarrass you with that. But I am very appreciative for you sharing everything. And I just didn't know, did you have anything else you wanted to leave us with before I drop your email in the chat and tell people they can follow up with you?
I mean, I would say if you can find a way to, if you can think through your passions, right? Say you want to go into IR. This is probably more particular to the field that I come from and the background that I'm in. If you can find something that you're passionate about, Middle East, China, zebras, types of pavement that they use in NASCAR, right? Like, you can always find a way to connect that back to an industry, to a policy type, to some form of social activism, to some form of grassroots engagement, right? Someone somewhere is like, tampering down that concrete for that like F1 track, right? Think through like what I guess you wake up in the morning excited about, and like think through the intersections of those things, right? Because you'll find weird ties that you won't know that exist. Like for me, I loved writing, and I loved writing about history. Come to find out, I love writing about foreign policy. Not only that, like I like analyzing and thinking, and it just turned into all these things. I'm like working on a book now and doing all these other things. So it's like simply because I liked expressing my feelings, because often I feel like I didn't have enough space up here to actually process them. So I processed on paper, and it turned out that other people were interested in reading. Surprise. Really, I don't know, I take 10 minutes, write down what interests you, and begin to like think through what those intersect with. Like you'll find a lot of really weird intersections that will probably just make you turn your eyebrow up, but like turn your head sideways and be like, huh. And then, go down a rabbit hole of Googling that connection and find something really cool that excites you. That was it.
Thank you. And this is being recorded tonight, so I will make sure that the recording gets to Brandon tomorrow. And those of you that are in attendance, we can always send out the recording. So if you want to go back and rehear anything that you missed or that you want to take a note, the recording will be there. But I just want to say thank you again to Jesse. Thank you again to Brandon. Fantastic job. And thank you to all of you that attended. Here is Jesse's email address so that you can copy and paste it if you have any follow-up questions with him. But again, just fantastic job, and just thank you for the hour of engagement. Very beneficial. And we hope that the other thing that I wanted to say, because Jesse touched on it about like reaching out to alumni, look for these types of events in the student announcements, so that you can see new alumni who might have a different career interest that you're thinking about, because we're constantly doing engagement opportunities like this. So join us again, and thank you all again. Hope you have a good night.
And thank you too. I appreciate it.